Okie doke. Hi, oops. Okie doke. Hi everyone. I'm going to record a few videos about technological progress and economic growth. And as you can see in the left-hand column, I'm going to talk about data, what is economic growth, what drives growth, why the differences across countries, and then briefly on directed technological change. So I guess it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 videos, but we'll see. I might split a couple of them into bits. Data. So what have we got here? We've got an x-axis with years, and we're going back 25,000 years in time. And we've got a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, so each interval is multiplying what's being measured by the same factor, in this case 2.7. Okay. And what do we see? Between a long time ago and pretty recently, 1700, average yearly production per capita was more or less constant. How do we get our heads around that? Well, basically, everyone had just about enough to survive and not a lot more. Okay, it's pretty clear when we look at the data we have. Of course, some individuals, well, if we go back sort of more than a couple of thousand years, or more than 4,000 or 5,000 years before cities started forming, clearly everybody was living more or less hand to mouth. It was just a case of food and shelter for the vast majority of the global population. If we get closer in time, of course, some people were reasonably rich by modern standards, but the vast majority were still just getting enough to eat and a roof over their heads, more or less. Okay, what about the population? That grew extremely slowly for about 20,000 years until about 5,000 years ago. And over this period here, from about 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, that's when we developed agriculture. So we went from foraging, hunting and gathering to growing food, and of course that allowed greater productivity per hectare of land, as you talked about with Pedro, so more people could survive. And they did. So the greater productivity, the new technologies, they led to more people, but not more consumption per capita. Okie doke. So I think that's basically what I wanted to tell you there. And then between 1700 and 1820, it's a sort of transitional period. But then, so we hop forward 100 years to 1820, and then show the next 200 years after that with global product per capita, again at the base year, and again a logarithmic scale, so these are doublings, these intervals, and we can see the doubling time for global product is gradually falling until about 60 odd years ago, or 60, 70 years ago, since when it's been fairly constant at probably about 25 years, I guess, is the doubling time, isn't it? 20, 25 years, 30, perhaps 30 years. Okie doke. And global population has followed a remarkably similar path, but with the difference that there is a marked leveling off. It hasn't leveled off yet, nothing like, but the growth rate, that doubling time, has extended, the growth rate has declined. Okay, here in the 60s and 70s, that was when the doubling time was at its lowest. Since then, that doubling time has been going down. And of course, all the projections say that it will continue to go down, and I think you've probably talked about that with Pedro, that there's this sort of lag built in. When you have a period of rapid population growth, then there's a lot of kids in the population, and then even if those kids end up only having 2 kids of their own each, the population will carry on growing for a while. But from that birth rate per adult, when that falls to 2 or below, we know in the long run the population is going to stabilize. Okay. What else do we see in the data? So this was global GDP. This is GDP per capita in the biggest global economy and one of the, perhaps the leading economy technologically. And that has been remarkably stable, that growth. Again, this is a logarithmic scale. So it's the doubling time that has been stable, which is the growth rate, the percentage growth per year is constant. That gives you a constant doubling time. Whereas a lot of other economies have very, very varying growth rates. This is for China, where we don't have much data for this period. There's like a point here and a point here, and we don't know very well. But basically here we're pretty much at that existence level of GDP. People have just about enough to survive. And then right up until about 1970, not a lot is happening. But then the Chinese gradually started changing their economic system, and growth absolutely took off. And now they're rapidly catching up with the US. Of course, in total GDP, they've pretty much caught up, or maybe even overtaken the US, I can't quite remember. But per capita, their GDP per capita is still quite a long way behind. This is slightly old data, isn't it, right? This must be like 2012 or something here, I guess. But they would have caught up even more by now. But there's still like 2 notches here, which is a factor of 4 less, right? Assuming this is the present day here somewhere. Okay, so that's the data. This is a different way of measuring growth. It's more like, this is called factor productivity. I don't know really why I'm showing you this one actually. It's a bit tricky to explain. But this is data from a guy called Philippon, also on long run growth. But he's not looking at GDP, he's looking at what's called total factor productivity. And he's saying that there are these kinks in the data. And this is a crucial kink to do with the general purpose technology of like electrification, basically, which he is saying in his article is sort of transformed the economy and given all sorts of growth opportunities which are being used here. Okay, and this is not a logarithmic scale. Okay, so how has this growth played out in people's lives? Okay, so far I've just shown you like, oh okay, I showed you US and China, but I've just been talking about economic growth and population. How has it actually affected people's lives? Well, here's 2 measures for that. This one in the middle, B, is the distribution of global population by income category in dollars per day, purchasing power parity dollars per day. And I put the scale 1960 to 2020 on all of these. even though for this middle one I don't have data earlier than like 1980 something. But this is just so that it's easy to compare. So what do we see here? This is people with less than $1.90 a day in 2011 dollars. The number of people on that very, very low income per day has actually fallen quite dramatically in absolute terms, from like 2 billion to less than 1 billion in the last 30 odd years. This is the people between, this block is between $1.90 and $3.20. The number of those people went up for a while as people moved from, well, partly because of population growth and partly because of people moving out of the 190 category. But then since a peak in about 2000, that category has been declining as well. The gap between these two lines is shrinking. And instead, this between $3.20 and $5.50 category has been growing slowly. Okay, this was quite a small category, 500 million people back in 1980-ish. Now it's 1.5 billion. And finally, the category with more than $5.50 a day, which started off at like 1.5 billion, has grown massively to what's this, like 1, 2, 3, 4 billion. Okay, so clearly it's not true to say, for instance, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer or something like that. On the global scale, people are moving up through these categories. The number of people in the really low desperate poverty category is shrinking, or has been shrinking in the long term. There are signs that that is, with climate change and COVID and so on, there are signs that this trend is stopping, and that is super worrying, but I don't have that data in this figure. Even more dramatic is the data on life expectancy. So back in 1960, there were 3 billion people on the planet in total. More than half of them didn't expect to live to 50. Now there's basically nobody who has a life expectancy at birth of as low as 50, and even less than 65 is only 1 billion out of 7.5 billion. So the vast majority of people expect at birth to live more than 65 years. So this is an incredible transformation, and this of course has to do with falling infant mortality, but also falling adult mortality. It has a huge amount to do with medical advance, or modern medicine reaching more and more people. And significant numbers of people expect to live to over 80 when they're born. Okey-doke. And of course you can find more data like this. You can look at Jeffrey Sachs's book, you can watch Hans Rosling's videos, super informative, just to give you an idea about what the world looks like and what the trends are. Okay. Okie doke, so that is the first video, I think. Yeah. Take home message 1, we are getting richer and healthier, and not just in the West or in the global North. Okay.